The divorce papers landed beside his coffee before Alexander Park looked up. The black leather folder stopped beneath the golden light of his office lamp, and the silence that followed carried one impossible question: who was brave enough to ask a mafia boss to let her go? Amara Williams stood across from him in her simple black maid uniform, her hands resting at her sides, the soft fabric of her sleeves contrasting against the cold marble floor beneath her. Outside the tall windows of the Park estate, the city lights reflected against the glass, while inside, the faint ticking of the antique clock filled every empty space between them. Alexander's fingers stopped moving over the documents he had been reading. For years, people entered his office asking for favors, protection, or approval. Nobody walked in carrying a decision that could change his entire world. "What is this?" His voice was calm, but the room seemed to tighten around the question. Amara stepped closer and placed her signature page on top. "A choice I should have been allowed to make a long time ago." The words were quiet, but they did not move. Alexander stared at the papers, then at the woman who had spent years taking care of his home, his meals, and the smallest details of a life built on control. She was the only person in the mansion who never lowered her eyes when he entered a room. The only person who spoke to him like he was a man, not a name feared across the city. The morning light spilled across the polished wooden desk as Amara turned toward the door. Her footsteps were steady against the stone floor. She did not wait for permission. She did not ask him to understand. Alexander watched the woman who had always been within reach walk away as if she had already accepted losing everything. That was the moment something unfamiliar crossed his carefully guarded expression. Not anger. Not pride. Fear of a future where she was no longer there. By evening, the mansion had changed. The warm glow of the chandeliers still filled the halls, the scent of fresh flowers still lingered near the entrance, but the atmosphere felt different. Alexander stood near the security room as his staff waited for instructions. Screens displayed every entrance, every gate, every pathway surrounding the estate. "Increase protection," he ordered. His security team exchanged uncertain looks. "Mr. Park, should we contact her family?" one asked. Alexander looked toward the hallway where Amara's room was located. The door was closed, a small suitcase resting nearby. "No. She stays here tonight." When Amara heard the lock click on the main entrance system, she walked into the hallway and found Alexander standing beneath the dim golden lights. The sound of the security mechanism echoed through the quiet mansion, and the cold metal handle felt different beneath her hand. "Did you lock the doors?" she asked. Alexander did not answer immediately. "There are people who would use this moment against you." Amara looked at him, her expression unreadable. "Protection without my choice is still a cage." The word struck harder than any accusation he had ever faced. Alexander glanced at the closed doors, then back at the woman standing in front of him. For the first time, the most powerful man in the room had no command that could fix what was breaking between them. Amara picked up her suitcase and walked toward the staircase, leaving him alone beneath the mansion lights. But before she disappeared from sight, Alexander made a decision that would change everything. He would uncover why the woman who had always stood beside him had finally chosen to walk away. And for the first time in his life, the doors he controlled were not the ones he needed to open. The next morning, Amara found the divorce papers placed exactly where she had left them, but something else was different. Her small suitcase sat beside the bedroom door, untouched. The hallway lights glowed softly against the dark wooden walls, and the quiet hum of the mansion's security system followed every step she took. She reached for the suitcase handle, but the sound of footsteps behind her stopped her. "Leaving without saying goodbye?" Alexander asked. His voice came from the end of the corridor, where the morning sunlight cut through the tall windows and painted sharp lines across the marble floor. Amara turned slowly. "I already said everything last night." Alexander walked closer, holding a folder instead of a command. The man who once controlled every room he entered now looked like someone searching for the right words. "You think I locked those doors because I wanted to control you?" Amara looked toward the entrance, where the heavy wooden doors remained closed. "Didn't you?" The question stayed between them. Alexander had faced rivals, negotiations, and threats without hesitation, but this was different. He could not intimidate an answer out of her. He could only listen. He opened the folder and placed several documents on the table near them. Your resignation papers. Your housing arrangement. Your financial security. Amara glanced down. You prepared all of this? Because if you leave, I want you to leave with everything you earned. Her fingers touched the edge of the papers, feeling the smooth surface beneath them. For years, she had worked inside his world, preparing his meals, organizing his home, remembering every detail others ignored. But nobody had ever asked what she wanted. She closed the folder. Money was never the reason I stayed. The words made Alexander pause. The chandelier above them reflected against the polished floor, and the faint scent of coffee from the kitchen drifted through the hallway. Then tell me why you stayed. Amara looked at him for a long moment. Because I believed there was a man beneath the reputation. Alexander lowered his eyes. It was the first time someone had spoken to him without fear or expectation. Later that afternoon, Amara continued packing her belongings. The room that once belonged to a maid felt strangely quiet. The soft fabric of her clothes folded into the suitcase, the wooden drawers closing with gentle clicks. Alexander stood outside the doorway, watching without entering. He noticed something he had never seen before. The room contained almost nothing that belonged to her. No expensive gifts. No jewelry. No reminders of his wealth. Only a few books, family photos, and a small plant sitting near the window. You were planning to disappear quietly, he said. Amara placed the last book inside the suitcase. I was planning to finally have a life that belonged to me. Alexander looked at the plant near the window. You took care of everything in this house. She gave a small nod. Including things nobody noticed. That evening, Alexander made a choice. He ordered the security system changed, not to keep Amara inside, but to protect her from outside pressure until she decided her next step. The locked doors opened. The gates remained guarded only by her permission. When Amara walked downstairs and saw the entrance standing open, she stopped. Alexander waited near the doorway. You were right, he said quietly. A door only matters if the person inside is free to leave. For the first time, Amara saw the powerful man everyone feared admit he had been wrong. But before she could answer, a message arrived on Alexander's phone. His expression changed as he read it. Someone from his past had discovered Amara was leaving the estate, and they knew exactly how much she meant to him. Alexander looked toward the open doors, then toward Amara. The choice he faced was no longer about keeping her close. It was about whether he could protect her without taking away the freedom she had fought to reclaim. The message on Alexander Park's phone changed the silence of the mansion. The screen's cold blue light reflected across his face while the open doorway behind him allowed the evening air to move through the grand entrance. Amara noticed the shift immediately. The man who always carried control like a second skin had suddenly become still. What happened? She asked. Alexander turned the phone face down on the table. Nothing you need to worry about. But Amara looked toward the security cameras glowing in the corner of the room, then back at him. That answer sounds familiar. The marble beneath their feet felt cold, and the distant sound of rain tapping against the glass windows filled the space between them. Alexander had spent years protecting his world with silence. Now, that silence was the very thing pushing her away. Someone found out about the divorce, he finally said. Amara's expression changed slightly. And? Alexander stepped toward the window, watching the city lights blur behind the rain-covered glass. And they believe you are the easiest way to reach me. The words remained heavy in the room. Amara looked at the open doors behind her. A few days ago, those doors represented everything she wanted to escape. Now, they represented a choice she had to make herself. So you want me to stay because you are afraid someone will use me? Alexander faced her. I want you to stay because I don't want you facing this alone. She studied him carefully. There was no command in his voice. No order. Only a request. But Amara had spent too long in a world where powerful men disguised demands as kindness. Alexander, you have to understand something. I cannot trade one cage for another. The words landed quietly, but they changed the room. Alexander lowered his gaze. Instead of arguing, he walked to the security panel beside the entrance. His hand hovered over the controls. Then he entered a new code. The locks disengaged. The heavy doors opened wider, letting the cool night air sweep through the hall. Then I will stop building cages, he said. Even if it means watching you walk away. Amara looked at him, surprised by the simplicity of the answer. For a man known for owning every room he entered, admitting he could not own her was the first real surrender she had ever seen. The next morning, Alexander made another unexpected move. He cancelled a private meeting that had been scheduled for weeks and asked Amara to join him at the estate's library. Sunlight filtered through the tall windows, touching the shelves filled with old books and polished wood. Dust floated through the golden beams, and the scent of aged paper mixed with fresh coffee on the table. Why am I here? Amara asked. Alexander placed a small box in front of her. Inside were letters, photographs, and documents from the years she had worked at the mansion. Because I realized something, he said. I knew everything about your responsibilities here, but almost nothing about you. Amara touched one of the photographs carefully. It showed a younger version of herself standing outside a community center, smiling beside people she had helped. You kept these? She asked. I noticed them when you thought nobody was watching. The answer caught her attention. Alexander was not trying to buy her forgiveness. He was finally seeing the person behind the role she played. But before the conversation could continue, the mansion's security system alerted them. A vehicle had stopped outside the main gate. Alexander looked at the screen, then at Amara. The person standing outside was someone from his past who had come with one message: if Amara left him, she would not be the only thing Alexander Park would lose. And this time, the choice between protecting her and respecting her freedom would be tested in front of everyone. The black sedan stopped behind the iron gates, its headlights cutting through the evening fog that covered the front courtyard. Amara stood beside the library window, watching the security monitors glow in the dark room. The faint hum of electronics mixed with the sound of rain hitting the glass, creating a tense rhythm that neither she nor Alexander could ignore. On the screen was a man Alexander had not seen in years. His name was Daniel Cho, a former associate who knew every weakness Alexander had ever hidden. He came because of me, Alexander said. Amara looked at him. No. He came because of the world you built around yourself. The words were quiet, but they carried weight. Alexander did not argue. Instead, he walked toward the entrance. Amara followed. The massive wooden doors opened slowly, revealing Daniel standing beneath the cold courtyard lights. The smell of wet pavement filled the air, and the stone steps shone beneath the rain. Alexander Park, Daniel said with a slight smile. I heard you finally found something you cannot control. Alexander remained still. Say what you came to say. Daniel glanced past him and noticed Amara standing nearby. So this is the woman who made the great Alexander hesitate. Amara stepped forward before Alexander could answer. I am not something to be used in your conversation. The courtyard fell silent. Even Daniel's expression changed for a moment. She was not speaking like someone standing behind a powerful man. She was speaking like someone who had finally reclaimed her own voice. Alexander looked at her, and for the first time, he did not step in front of her. He stepped beside her. Daniel noticed the difference. Interesting, he said. The old Alexander would have handled this alone. The old Alexander made too many decisions for other people, Alexander replied. The rain continued falling against the stone, and the security lights reflected in the puddles between them. Daniel placed a small envelope on the table near the entrance. Inside is information about your business partners. If you want to keep your empire, you will need to make sacrifices. His eyes moved toward Amara. Some sacrifices are obvious. Before Alexander could react, Amara picked up the envelope and placed it back into Daniel's hand. If your plan requires someone else to lose their freedom, then it is not a solution. Daniel stared at her. Nobody had ever interrupted his negotiations that way. Alexander watched silently as Amara walked back inside. She had changed the entire balance of the room without raising her voice. Later that night, Alexander found her in the kitchen. The warm lights above the counters softened the dark mansion around them. The smell of tea filled the air, and the quiet sound of rain continued against the windows. "You should have let me handle him," Alexander said. Amara looked up while placing a cup on the table. "That is exactly what I mean." She pointed toward the chair across from her. "You always handle things. You decide. You protect. You control. But you never ask what the other person wants." Alexander sat down. The chair scraped softly against the wooden floor. For a moment, the most feared man in the city looked like someone hearing a truth he had avoided for years. "What do you want?" he asked. Amara looked at the divorce papers still resting inside her bag. "I want to know if you are fighting to keep me because you love me, or because you cannot accept losing." The question remained unanswered. The next morning, Alexander made a decision that shocked everyone in his organization. He announced that Amara would no longer be treated as an employee of the Park estate. Her position, her responsibilities, and her future would belong only to her choice. But when Amara received the final divorce documents with Alexander's signature already attached, she realized he had done something she never expected. He had finally opened the last door. And now she had to decide whether freedom meant walking away, or returning to the man who had finally learned how to let her go. The divorce papers sat untouched on Amara's kitchen table for 3 days. The morning light slipped through the curtains, painting soft patterns across the wooden surface, while the quiet sound of boiling water filled the small apartment she had chosen for herself outside the Park estate. For the first time in years, the space belonged only to her. No mansion rules. No expectations. No footsteps waiting for her to serve someone else. Yet the empty chair across from her felt heavier than it should have. A knock interrupted the silence. Amara froze for a moment before opening the door. Alexander stood outside, wearing a dark coat instead of his usual tailored suit. He carried no security team, no assistant, and no expression that demanded obedience. "What are you doing here?" Amara asked. The hallway light above them flickered softly, and the distant sound of elevators moving through the building echoed behind him. Alexander looked at the papers on the table. "Returning something that belongs to you." He placed a small wooden box beside the divorce documents. Amara opened it carefully. Inside was a simple necklace she had lost years ago while working at the mansion. She looked up. "You kept this?" Alexander nodded. "Because you looked for it for 3 days." She remembered that moment. She had assumed nobody noticed. "You remember things like that?" "Only the things that mattered." The answer made the room quiet. But Amara closed the box. "Alexander, remembering my favorite tea or finding something I lost does not erase everything else." He accepted the words without defense. That was different. The old Alexander would have explained, justified, or controlled the situation. This Alexander simply stood there and listened. "Then tell me what I did wrong," he said. Amara looked toward the window. The city moved below them, cars passing through wet streets, their headlights reflecting on the pavement. "You protected me, but you never trusted me. You gave me everything except a choice." Alexander lowered his eyes. "I thought if I kept you safe, I was showing you that you mattered. But safety without freedom feels like a prison." The sentence stayed between them. Later that evening, Alexander returned to his office, where the walls were covered with years of achievements, contracts, and decisions. The room smelled of leather and old paper, and the golden desk lamp cast a narrow circle of light over his files. For the first time, he removed a document from his private cabinet that had nothing to do with business. It was a record of every request Amara had made during her years at the estate. Every suggestion. Every idea. Every time she tried to improve things. He realized something painful. He had always seen her as someone who helped him build his world, but he never asked what world she wanted to build for herself. The next morning, Alexander made a public decision inside his organization. He transferred ownership of the charity foundation Amara had secretly helped manage for years into her name. When she arrived at the foundation building, she found the documents waiting on the desk. The office was filled with sunlight, fresh flowers, and the sound of employees preparing for the day. "Why would you do this?" she asked when Alexander entered. "Because it was never mine," he replied. "You built it." Amara looked through the papers, then at him. "And what do you want in return?" Alexander paused. "Nothing." That answer surprised her more than any grand gesture could have. A man who had spent his entire life collecting power was finally giving something away without asking for control. But that night, another message arrived. Alexander's advisors warned him that his decision had created enemies inside his own organization. They believed Amara was the reason he had changed, and they planned to force him back into the man he used to be. When Amara heard about it, she found Alexander standing alone in the empty mansion, surrounded by unlocked doors and silent rooms. "If staying near you puts you in danger, maybe the divorce is still the right choice," she said. Alexander looked at her, the woman he had tried so hard to keep close. This time, he did not reach for control. He simply asked one question: "If I let you leave, will you believe I finally understand why?" And for the first time, Amara saw the man behind the mafia boss willing to lose everything just to prove he had changed. Alexander stood alone in the mansion's grand hall, surrounded by the silence he had created. The doors were unlocked, the security screens were dimmed, and the cold marble floor reflected the pale morning light coming through the windows. For the first time in years, the place that represented his power felt unfamiliar. Then Amara entered. She carried no suitcase this time. Her footsteps moved slowly across the polished floor, and the soft sound echoed beneath the high ceiling. "You really mean it," she said, looking at the open doors. Alexander turned toward her. "I should have understood it sooner." The words were simple, but for a man who rarely admitted mistakes, they carried a different weight. Amara looked around the mansion. The same walls that once felt like a boundary now seemed almost empty. "You changed everything after I asked for a divorce." Alexander nodded. "Because losing you made me realize I never truly had you." The sentence stopped her for a moment. Outside, the city moved beneath a gray sky, cars passing through wet streets while distant thunder rolled across the horizon. The world continued as normal, but inside the mansion, everything had shifted. Alexander invited Amara into his office, but this time he did not sit behind the large wooden desk. He sat across from her. Equal distance. Equal space. The room smelled of old leather and fresh coffee, and the golden lamp beside them cast a warm glow over the documents between them. "I signed the divorce papers," he said. Amara looked down. The signature was there. No conditions. No demands. No hidden agreements. "Why?" she asked. Alexander looked at the papers instead of her. "Because love that requires someone to stay is not love." The answer was not what she expected. For years, she had seen Alexander as a man who could buy anything, command anyone, and solve every problem with power. But now, the one thing he wanted most was the only thing he refused to force. Amara slowly closed the folder. "You are different." Alexander gave a quiet smile. "Maybe I was always capable of changing. I just never had a reason before." Later that day, Amara visited the foundation building Alexander had transferred to her. The bright office was filled with voices, paperwork, and sunlight. Employees greeted her by name, not because of Alexander, but because of the work she had done. She stood near the window, watching people move through the halls she had helped create. The warmth of the room contrasted with the cold emptiness of the mansion. For the first time, she saw a future that belonged completely to her. But when she returned that evening, she found Alexander in the kitchen preparing tea. The sight almost felt impossible. The most feared man in the city stood beside a quiet counter, carefully following instructions from a handwritten recipe she had once left behind. The scent of tea leaves filled the room, mixing with the soft sound of rain against the glass. "You made this yourself?" Amara asked. Alexander looked at the cup. "I thought I should learn something instead of always asking someone else to do it." A small silence followed. Then Amara sat down. They spoke for hours, not about the divorce, not about power, but about things they had never shared before. Dreams. Regrets. The lives they wanted outside the roles they had been trapped in. But before the night ended, Alexander received another message. This time, it was not a warning. It was an ultimatum from his organization: choose between maintaining control of the mafia empire or walking away from everything that made him powerful. Alexander read the message, then placed the phone on the table. Amara noticed. "What will you do?" she asked. Alexander looked at her, then toward the open doors leading outside. "For once, I will choose the person I want to become." And with that decision, the man who built his life around control prepared to risk losing the one thing the world could never give him back. Alexander Park walked into the underground meeting room without his usual entourage. The heavy steel doors closed behind him with a deep sound that echoed through the empty space, and the cold air inside carried the faint smell of polished metal and old wood. For years, this room had been where he made decisions that shaped his empire. Tonight, it was where he would decide whether he still belonged to it. Around the long table sat the people who had followed him for years. Their faces remained silent beneath the dim lights hanging above. "You are choosing a woman over everything we built?" one of them asked. Alexander placed a folder on the table. Inside were signed documents transferring control of several operations to new leadership. The room shifted. Nobody expected him to give away power willingly. "I am choosing not to become someone who destroys the people he claims to protect," Alexander replied. Across the city, Amara was preparing for a different kind of goodbye. She stood inside the mansion's former staff room, carefully packing the last few belongings she had left behind. The room smelled of fresh linen and old wood, and sunlight from the afternoon window touched the simple items she had collected over the years. A small book. A photograph. A handwritten recipe. Things that belonged to her, not to the role she had played. When Alexander returned that evening, he found her near the entrance. The doors were open. The same doors that once represented his control now allowed the cool evening breeze to move freely through the hall. "You are leaving," he said softly. Amara looked at the suitcase beside her. "I need to know who I am when I am not standing behind your shadow." Alexander nodded. There was no anger. No argument. Only acceptance. "Then go." The words surprised her. After everything that happened, she expected another attempt to stop her. Another promise. Another reason to stay. Instead, Alexander stepped aside. The hallway lights reflected on the marble floor between them, creating a clear path to the exit. "Why are you letting me go?" Amara asked. Alexander looked at the open doorway. "Because if you return, I want it to be because you choose me, not because I trapped you." For a moment, neither of them moved. The silence carried more meaning than any confession. Later that night, Amara arrived at her new apartment. The small kitchen light glowed warmly, the sound of the city filled the streets below, and for the first time, she experienced a life completely separate from Alexander Park. But something felt different. She no longer missed the mansion. She missed the man who had finally learned how to stop holding on. Meanwhile, Alexander stood in his empty office. The large desk, the expensive decorations, and the walls filled with achievements looked exactly the same. Yet everything felt changed. A message appeared on his phone. The organization had accepted his decision, but one condition remained: He had to publicly step away from the old life that created his reputation. The next morning, cameras gathered outside a press conference. Reporters waited for the Korean Mafia boss known across the city for his power and influence. Alexander walked onto the stage without hesitation. He announced his withdrawal from the empire he had spent years building. The room erupted with questions. But he answered only one. "Do you regret giving up everything?" Alexander looked toward the cameras, his expression calm. "I regret waiting so long to understand what was truly valuable." That evening, Amara watched the announcement from her apartment. The television light reflected across her quiet room. She saw the man who once locked every door finally open every one of them. Then her phone rang. Alexander's name appeared on the screen. She hesitated before answering. "Amara," his voice said, softer than she had ever heard. "I am not calling to ask you to come back." A pause followed. "I am calling because you deserve to know that I finally became the man you believed was there." And for the first time since the divorce papers were signed, Amara held the phone without knowing whether she was saying goodbye or hearing the beginning of something new. Amara stood beneath the soft glow of her apartment kitchen light, the small room filled with the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the scent of fresh coffee drifting through the air. On the table in front of her sat the divorce papers she had once believed would be the final page of her life with Alexander Park. But the signature she expected was no longer the thing holding her attention. It was the message on her phone. "I need to see you. Not as your husband. Not as your boss. Just as Alexander." She stared at the screen, her fingers resting against the cold glass surface. For months, every door between them had represented control, distance, and fear. But now, for the first time, one had been left open by choice. Across the city, Alexander entered a building he once owned. The marble floors reflected the white ceiling lights, and the sound of his footsteps echoed through the empty hallway. The empire that once surrounded him had become a place where he no longer belonged. He carried no guards, no symbols of power, only a simple coat and the same worn watch Amara had once repaired for him when nobody else noticed it was broken. When they met at a quiet cafe, the rain tapping against the windows created a steady rhythm, mixing with the sound of cups moving across wooden tables. Amara sat across from him, watching the man who once commanded entire rooms now waiting silently for her permission to speak. "Why did you ask me here?" she asked. Alexander placed a small envelope on the table. Inside were the final documents confirming that every legal tie between them had been released. No hidden conditions. No restrictions. No locked doors. "Because you were right," he said. "Love cannot exist inside a cage." The words remained between them as the cafe lights reflected on the polished table surface. Amara opened the envelope slowly. She had expected another request, another attempt to convince her to return. Instead, Alexander had brought her freedom. But before she could answer, he stood and reached for his coat. "I will not ask you to come back," he said. "If you ever stand beside me again, I want it to be because you see the man I became, not the man who held you." That evening, Amara returned to the neighborhood where she had started rebuilding her life. The streets were filled with the smell of food from nearby restaurants, and warm yellow lights spilled onto the sidewalks. She walked past the small cafe where she worked before, past the places where she had once lowered her eyes and stayed silent. This time, she walked with her head raised. Days passed. Alexander continued living without the empire that had defined him. He started a foundation, helped workers who had been ignored for years, and built something that no longer depended on fear. Then one afternoon, Amara arrived at the foundation office. The glass doors reflected the city skyline, and the sound of people working filled the bright room. Alexander looked up from his desk and froze. She placed a folder in front of him. "What is this?" he asked. Amara opened it. Inside was a proposal to join the foundation as an equal partner, not as a wife, not as a maid, but as herself. "I am not coming back to the old life," she said. "But maybe we can build something different." Alexander looked at the document, then at her. The man who once locked every door now had no desire to close any. But before he could answer, Amara's phone vibrated. A message appeared from an unknown number. Her expression changed as she read the words. "They know you walked away from him." She slowly turned the screen toward Alexander. For the first time in months, the past they thought they had left behind had found them again, and this time, it was standing at their door. The message arrived at midnight, glowing against the dark screen of Amara's phone. The office was silent except for the soft clicking of the old wall clock and the distant hum of traffic below. Alexander read the words once, then placed the phone face down on the wooden desk. No guards entered. No orders were given. The man who once controlled every corner of the city simply looked at Amara and asked, "What do you want to do?" The question stayed in the room longer than any command ever had. The next morning, Amara and Alexander walked into the foundation building together. Sunlight spilled through the tall glass windows, warming the stone floor, while the scent of fresh paper and coffee filled the lobby. Everyone who had known Alexander as a feared Korean Mafia boss watched as he stepped aside and allowed Amara to speak first. She placed the proposal from the night before on the conference table. "This organization was built on trust, not control," she said. "And if we are going to protect people, we cannot become the thing that hurt them." The executives lowered their eyes toward the documents. There were no arguments. No threats. Only the sound of pages turning and the quiet realization that the woman they once overlooked was now shaping the future of the entire organization. Later that afternoon, Alexander returned to the apartment where Amara had once packed her belongings, preparing to leave him forever. The room looked different now. The locks had been changed, but the doors were open. The heavy curtains moved gently with the breeze from the balcony, and the faint smell of jasmine from the small plant near the window filled the space. He placed the divorce papers on the table and touched the signature he had written weeks before. Amara entered slowly and looked at him. "You kept your promise," she said. Alexander nodded. "I should have done it sooner." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence carried everything they had never been able to say when power stood between them. Alexander removed the key to the private room where he once kept every decision, every secret, every part of his world locked away. He placed it beside the divorce papers. "This belongs to you now," he said. Amara looked at the key, then pushed it back toward him. "No," she answered. "Not mine. Not yours. Ours, if we choose it." Months later, the same city that once whispered about Alexander's cold reputation began telling a different story. The foundation expanded. Workers received support. Families who had been ignored found someone willing to listen. And beside Alexander was Amara, not behind him, not beneath him, but standing equal. One evening, they returned to the small cafe where they had first spoken after their separation. The warm lights reflected on the windows, the smell of roasted coffee filled the air, and the wooden table between them carried the marks of countless conversations. Alexander looked at the woman who had once asked for a divorce because she needed her freedom. "Would you make the same choice again?" he asked. Amara smiled faintly and looked toward the open door of the cafe. "Yes," she said. "Because I needed to leave before I could choose to stay." Outside, the city moved beneath the evening lights, but inside that quiet cafe, the man who once locked every door finally understood why the greatest love could only exist when two people were free to walk through one together. And that day, the world remembered that dignity is never protected by holding someone close, but by giving them the freedom to choose you.